small business owner. So you wish to be at one with your enterprise. First, you must attain inner peace of small business insurance. This is Zensurance.
If you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, or a contractor, peace of mind is just a click away at zensurance.com, Canada's leading source for small business insurance. It's quick, easy, and affordable. Get an instant price today at zensurance.com.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
For all of the people in the world who live with autism, and all of the people in the world who love and sometimes care for them, there is still an awful lot we don't know about the condition. We know more than we used to, of course, but in the grand scheme of understanding where it comes from, how it happens, and how to help people with the more severe forms of it, well, we're still largely searching in the dark a lot of the time, looking for tools that might help us better understand. And one of those tools, for years, has been lab mice, genetically engineered to display similar behavioral characteristics as some humans with autism. But the value of those experiments has become the subject of a fierce debate among neuroscientists. And it also gets at the heart of the debate around what we do and don't understand about autism. Should we be trying to cure it? How? What would that even look like in practice? Where should we actually focus our research? And when you start trying to answer those questions, you tiptoe through an ethical minefield. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Celia Ford is a PhD in neuroscience. She is a future perfect fellow at Vox. Hi, Celia.
Hi, how's it going?
It is going great. I'm excited to talk about this. This is fascinating stuff, and I imagine a little bit controversial in terms of the replies you've gotten.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Why don't we start with the groundwork for what we're going to talk about today, and maybe you can try to explain quickly to all of us, why are mice so important to neuroscience research?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people outside of the kind of insular world of biomedical science don't necessarily realize how many mice scientists use for almost everything. So mice are small, they breed quickly, they can start having babies around 2 months old, sometimes even younger, and scientists are pretty good at genetically manipulating them because the whole mouse genome has been sequenced for a couple of decades already, like just about as long as the human genome has. So scientists have tons of tools that they can use to modify gene expression that were built with mice in mind. And then in the neuroscience world specifically, neuroscience is just hard because studying how stuff in the brain causes behavior kind of requires having a living brain that's connected to a living body, right?
Right.
So we can study human brains in kind of a limited capacity. We can use things like fMRI scanners, but they paint a pretty hazy picture of what the brain is actually doing. It's kind of like trying to figure out what's happening at a baseball game by standing outside of the stadium and listening to the cheers and trying to like figure out what the play is. It's just really almost impossible. And people really don't love the idea of doing invasive brain recordings in humans for obvious reasons. So neuroscientists often do them in mice instead, which, at least in theory, they share the vast majority of their genes with humans. So the idea is that it's like close enough.
I was going to ask about that. Like, how successfully have mouse brains stood in for human brains in terms of like successful past neuroscience research and development?
Yeah, I think that depending on who you ask, people might have a different answer for this. I would say mice have been kind of successful sometimes. So studies in rodents have helped us to learn a lot of the basics about how brains work, like our understanding of what chemicals cells in the brain are using to talk to each other. For example, a lot of that comes from work in mice and rats. And some of that has led to the development of some promising new medicines. So, for example, our understanding of GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy and how those drugs reduce food cravings, all of that started with studies of dopamine in lab rats in the 80s. So I would say that that's, at least for now, seems like a success. But again, for intuitive reasons, it's hard to use animals as stand-ins for the human brain when we're talking about complicated things like depression or dementia or, I don't know, psychedelics, anything that's really defined by human behavior or a subjective human experience gets a little bit tricky to figure out how to draw those parallels between humans and animals.
Speaking of research into things that are incredibly complicated inside the brain and we don't quite understand how it works, how have researchers attempted to use mice in research into autism in humans?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think you're right. Autism falls under that umbrella of complicated things that are really hard to model in animals. And autism, by definition, is a spectrum. Like the technical diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder.
Right.
So a really wide range of people with very different symptoms can all be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And the core traits of autism, so things like communication challenges and trouble navigating social interactions, are really kind of deeply embedded in our humanness. And like mice don't talk like we do. Mice don't engage in the same social situations that we do. So coming up with ways of modeling autism in mice is challenging.
So how do you even model autism in neuroscience research then?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that most scientists would generally agree that autism is to some extent shaped by genetics. It seems to be hereditary, like it runs in families. And over the past couple of decades, researchers have winnowed down a list of about 100 gene mutations that seem to be linked to autism. It's like if you look at the genomes of a bunch of humans with autism and their families, some genes seem to be more likely to be expressed in that population than in people without autism. So to give a mouse autism, theoretically, researchers can give a mouse one of those gene mutations and see if it changes their behavior. And so far, neuroscientists have bred about 20 or so different mouse models of autism that are focused on different gene mutations and different behaviors that fall out of that.
When we talk about, again, the spectrum of autism, it can consist of tons of different behaviors that, I think people would still argue whether or not they're on the spectrum, right? So what does that actually look like in its behavior when we're talking about mice?
Yeah, so I think that it really depends on which specific gene is involved. And also it probably depends on a lot of other more finicky, trivial things like what the mouse's cage looks like and how they're being taken care of. But usually a mouse model of autism is trying to capture at least one core trait of autism in humans. So for example, some mouse models of autism are known for engaging in repetitive or compulsive behaviors. Like they might be more likely to overgroom themselves, just like licking themselves until their hair is coming out, which neuroscientists try to relate to repetitive movements that are seen in autistic humans. So we often would call that stimming, people kind of like self-stimulating with these repetitive behaviors. So some mice seem to do something like that. And other autistic mouse models, if you can call them that, show some kind of social discomfort, maybe. They seem like they're less likely to seek interactions with new mice than other mouse usually would be, or they might squeak at each other less. But I think that the big thing is like is this actually close enough to the behavior of humans with autism to say very much about autism? And I think that that's really up for debate.
Well, this is kind of the heart of the debate that we wanted to talk with you about today. So just ask that question, ask you to explain it as best you can after all of this research on mice and autism. How much more do we understand about its root causes in humans, and what kind of treatments and possibilities have come out of it, if anything?
Yeah, I'd say that as far as how much do we understand, not much, honestly, which unfortunately is true about almost anything having to do with the brain, which is a famously extremely complicated organ. So we know some things that definitely aren't true, right? Like there was one study claiming that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That study has been totally debunked, retracted from the journal it was published in, and the researcher behind it has his medical license taken away. Right. So and yet, people still believe this, but I want to make it very clear that there is absolutely zero evidence that vaccines cause autism, right? Beyond that, people have a lot of different theories. Some theories suggest that autism can be influenced by things in the prenatal environment, like maybe a mother has a high fever when they're pregnant, for example, and that somehow affects fetal development. And, again, scientists disagree on how strong of an influence that might have or exactly how that even works. And we have a few theories about how differences in brain structure or function lead to autism, some of which came from studies in mice or even in cells. So one theory is that the brains of autistic people have too much electrical activity or too weak of brakes on that electrical activity. So their brains are overexcitable. And then there's another theory that maybe connections between brain regions are different in the brains of autistic people versus people without autism. But again, none of these theories has really been definitively proven to be true. The main thing that we seem to know is that autism is influenced by genetics somehow. And then I think beyond that, it's all still very much a work in progress.
Be honest. When was the last time you thought about your current business insurance policy? If your existing business insurance policy is renewing on autopilot each year without checking out Zensurance, you're probably spending more than you need. That's why you need to switch to low-cost coverage from Zensurance before your policy renews this year. Zensurance does all the heavy lifting to find a policy, covering only what you need, and policies start at only $19 per month. So if your policy is renewing soon, go to Zensurance.com and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance, mind your business.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
The genetics thing is what I want to dive deeper into, because there is, as I understand it, and you can explain it maybe a little more, a lot of controversy around the research here potentially determining the root genetic cause of autism, which would, again, potentially allow us to test and screen for it, right? Can you explain why that is a contentious issue in autism therapy, but also in neuroscience fields?
Totally, yeah. So I think to pin down the big fear around this in one word, people would probably say eugenics is the biggest concern.
Right.
But I'll break this down a little bit more because I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. So framing autism as a disease that is something that might happen to an otherwise healthy child as a consequence of something like genetics, it makes it feel like it's something that science can do something about. And for many diseases like a deadly cancer or like chronic cardiac diseases, this wouldn't be controversial. People would say, oh, great, this is something that science can fix, so we should fix it. Nobody wants deadly cancer. But I think that many autistic adults believe that framing autism this way is very misguided. And they have raised some serious concerns about eugenics, especially the concern is that if parents could get a prenatal test for autism, many people would choose to do so. And many of those people would then choose not to have those children, who are arguably children who would go on to have a totally great, fulfilling life. And this has played out in other prenatal tests. So these fears are not unfounded. So, for example, many parents across several countries have access to prenatal tests for Down syndrome. And most of the time, if a parent finds out that their child will have Down syndrome, they'll choose not to give birth to that child. So today, a lot of people that are embracing the neurodiversity movement would argue that autism is not a disease that needs to be cured. It's simply another way to move through the world. And the disabilities related to autism are more a consequence of a lack of understanding and social support than some fundamental disease state, if that makes sense. But some people, especially the parents and caregivers of autistic people who have high support needs, like maybe who need 24/7 caregiving, would argue that their loved ones need better medical treatments to help them get through everyday life independently. And I've heard people kind of in this camp sometimes argue that autistic people who can advocate for themselves are leaving more disabled people behind. So that's kind of the tension here. And my understanding in talking to people that are kind of on both sides of this, it seems like everyone would love to understand autism better. I think nobody's arguing that we don't want to do any more research. But today, the vast majority of autism research funding in the US, and historically this has been true in Canada as well, goes towards genetics and biology research, leaving a relatively small amount of funding behind for studying things like education or employment or finding better housing. And autistic self-advocates just want to rebalance that funding and shift a little bit more money towards things that would help autistic people in the immediate future, and a little bit less towards biology studies that might help in the long run, but in the immediate future haven't resulted in much.
And when we talk about focusing more on treatments and outcomes and investment rather than specifically on identifying whatever genes may be behind this, how do you then do that research using mice and the brain activity we can see in them? Because again, the vast spectrum of autism seems like something it would be really hard to replicate behavior-wise in a tiny little lab mouse.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So, one strategy that some neuroscientists have tried doing is coming up with better, less error-prone tests of mouse behavior. So one huge problem in studying mouse behavior is that for a long time, and this was true when I was in grad school, the way that you were analyzing their behavior was by literally sitting in a room looking at a mouse doing something and writing tally marks on a piece of paper, which, as you can imagine, if you are a tired, burnt out, underpaid grad student, there is a high chance that you're going to make a mistake at some point. So some people argue that if we can do things like analyze videos of mouse movement using AI rather than a grad student's eyeballs, we might be able to come up with more standardized, better measurements of mouse behavior. That's one idea, but I would argue that there's a lot of lower hanging fruit that could be tackled in mouse models that would make a lot more sense than trying to look at behavior. So, for example, there are things where there are more obvious parallels between mouse models and humans, like seizure disorders. Mice can have seizures, humans have seizures. They're probably caused by the same thing, and they look very similar in both animals, right? If we call humans animals. So developing better seizure medications would actually help a lot of people with autism, because many people with autism also have epilepsy, which is a seizure disorder. So I think that would be a totally okay use of mouse models. But there are also a lot of things like developing better communication aids or better pedagogy for education that don't require testing anything in animal models at all. I think that many of the things that would make the biggest quality of life differences for autistic people, like finding more better stable jobs or getting more funding for in-home care services, those things don't need to be tested in mice first.
When you look at the larger picture of research into neurological conditions, how many others aside from autism does this approach apply to, where we are spending so much money and time and energy in the brains of some of our best people just trying to figure out the root cause so we can maybe tweak it when we could be just learning more about it and how to understand it and apply it directly to the people living with those conditions?
Yeah, so I don't know the specific funding breakdowns for all of these disorders,
Sure.
But I do think that this phenomenon is certainly not unique to autism. Scientists also use mice to study pretty much any brain-related thing that you can think of. So depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, the subjective effects of psychedelic drugs, right? All of these things have been studied in mouse models, even in like fruit fly models, rat models, monkey models, all kinds of animals. And in all of these cases, it's often really hard to map the human behavioral manifestation of these diagnoses onto whatever animal is being used as a model. And then the other thing that I get frustrated by is that lab mice are not even really good models of mouse behavior because they're living in very strange, deprived conditions that are far from their natural habitat. It would be kind of like only doing psychology studies in people who grew up in solitary confinement and then saying that that was an accurate model of neurotypical behavior. Like intuitively, we can understand that somebody that grew up in an environment like that would probably behave differently than people who grew up in a more standard living situation. So I think that kind of across the board, it's very challenging to study these human psychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders, or even neurodegenerative disorders in animal models that are already kind of poor models of themselves.
And when you're doing it with a condition like autism that, first of all, impacts so many people, but also really has a lot of passionate advocates on basically all sides of everything. And you're trying to dive into which direction we should go with research. What is the response like to a piece like this that tries to really get at what we know, what we don't know, and maybe what we should try to know and do?
Yeah, I would say it heated.
Yeah, it was a long-winded way to ask you about angry emails, probably.
Yeah. So I received a lot of positive feedback from the kind of autistic self-advocate community. So a lot of autistic adults seemed to give this a thumbs up. I also heard a lot of nice things from neuroscientists, honestly, who maybe used to do this kind of research and became a little bit jaded by it, or even who are currently doing this kind of research and are kind of questioning whether it makes the most sense to do or whether there's a better way of studying the problems that they're passionate about. But I think that, yeah, I was shocked. I only received one angry email from the parent of an autistic person who seemed to have like pretty high support needs. And that person was predictably upset at me for suggesting that we shouldn't be researching the biology of autism, to which I would reply, I don't think that you read the article entirely, because at the end of it, I think that we should absolutely still be studying basic biology studies of how autism manifests in the brain. For the sake of understanding it, I think that it's really important. I just think that research funding priorities are a little bit skewed in the wrong direction. And then I also think that people who work for the funding agencies that are giving grants to the scientists that are doing this kind of research were also not particularly happy with the way that I portrayed those funding agencies. Because essentially I was saying, like, I think that the priorities of funders are again, they're a little bit skewed in the wrong direction, where we could be devoting a little bit more money to studies that will help people live better lives in the present. I mean, honestly, the ideal solution is that we would just have a bigger pot of money so that everybody could receive lots of money. That would be great. But given that the government is very unlikely to do that, I just think that some of the money that biology is currently receiving should be given elsewhere. And the people in charge of the biology money were not thrilled about that.
I mean, fair enough on their part. The last thing I want to ask you about is the future, because we are going to continue this research. And I want to just assume for a moment that we continue to get better at it. I know the brain is incredibly confusing, but we're better at it now than we were 20, 30 years ago. And that's going to continue. So if this research continues, what happens when we do, or if we do, I guess, figure out, oh, it's these 3 genes? At that point, who has to step in and what kind of decisions will have to be made?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really good question. And I know that for a while in the US, and I'm sure that a Canadian policy wonk can fact check me on this, but I think that there's now a similar committee in Canada that is basically comprised of people who are both autistic and non-autistic, who advise the government and federal agencies on how they should be making decisions relating to autism, both in terms of research funding and in terms of just what kinds of research questions should be prioritized. So I think that it's really important, especially as we continue to advance in the research world, to include people with autism in these conversations. Because I think at the end of the day, the people who have the thing should probably be in charge of what we do about it. And again, I think that this is going to be a really long game, right? The kind of basic science research, studying things for the sake of learning more about them that we're doing here, takes forever. The brain is really complicated. Neuroscientists have barely scratched the surface of understanding it, much less what happens when the brain is not neurotypical. We understand that even less. So maybe someday the kinds of studies that we've been doing in mouse models and elsewhere will cobble together enough knowledge to make the human brain and human autism make sense. But I think it's going to take a very long time.
Celia, thank you so much for this. This was a fascinating conversation, and I think I understand a really complicated issue a little better now.
Oh, well, that's the best possible thing that I could hear. Thank you so much for having me.
Celia Ford, PhD in neuroscience, writing for Vox. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We're available in all your favorite podcast players and, of course, on your smart speaker when you ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.
Are you self-employed? Don't think you need business insurance? Think again. Business insurance from Zensurance is a no-brainer for every business owner because it provides peace of mind. A lot can go wrong. A fire, stolen equipment, or an unhappy customer suing you. That's why you need insurance. Don't let the "I'm too small for this" mindset hold you back from protecting yourself. Zensurance provides customized business insurance policies starting at just $19 per month. Visit Zensurance.com today and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance, mind your business.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.